She accidentally called the millionaire baby, and his reaction made her heart tremble. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. Some mistakes change everything. This one changed 2 lives forever. The 47th floor of the Meridian Tower buzzed with the kind of tension that came with handling billions of dollars before breakfast. Lena Carter adjusted her charcoal blazer and smoothed down her carefully straightened hair as she stepped off the elevator, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor in a rhythm she'd perfected over 2 years. At 25, Lena had learned to navigate this world of glass offices and power suits with the grace of someone who understood that survival here meant being invisible when necessary and indispensable always. Her warm brown skin seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that most people in this building had learned to respect, even if they didn't always acknowledge it. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her 5'6" frame wrapped in the kind of professional attire that said she belonged here without trying too hard to prove it. Her natural hair was pulled back into a sleek bun that framed her heart-shaped face perfectly, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the soft cadence of someone who chose her words carefully. "Morning, Lena," called out Marcus from accounting, one of the few people who bothered to acknowledge her existence with genuine warmth. "Good morning, Marcus." Her smile was brief but sincere. She had exactly 7 minutes before Damian Walker's first conference call with the Tokyo office, and in her world, 7 minutes might as well be 7 seconds. The corner office loomed ahead like a fortress, its frosted glass doors bearing the simple inscription, "Damian Walker, CEO." Beyond those doors lived the man who could make grown executives weep with a single glance, who had built Walker Investments from nothing into a financial empire worth $12 billion, and who had never, not once in the 2 years she'd worked for him, said please or thank you. Lena had seen assistants before her quit after 3 days. One had lasted 2 weeks before having what could only be described as a nervous breakdown in the supply closet. But Lena had something the others didn't, the ability to see past the ice-cold exterior to something that might have been human underneath. She pushed through the outer office, her domain for the past 24 months. Everything here reflected her touch, the perfectly organized filing system, the fresh orchids on the windowsill that somehow thrived despite the lack of natural warmth in the space, and the coffee station that she maintained with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. As she settled into her ergonomic chair and powered up her computer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed the familiar extension that made everyone else in the building break into a cold sweat. "Good morning, Mr. Walker's office," she answered, cradling the phone between her shoulder and ear as she simultaneously opened his calendar and reached for the stack of files that needed his attention before the 9:30 meeting. The Morrison contract. His voice came through the line like winter itself, clear, cutting, and completely devoid of warmth. Damian Walker didn't waste time on pleasantries. At 38, he had transformed from a nobody from Queens into one of the most feared and respected men on Wall Street, and he had no patience for anything that didn't serve his empire. Standing at 6'3" with the kind of build that spoke of early morning workouts and disciplined living, Damian was the kind of handsome that made people stop and stare, even when they knew they shouldn't. His dark hair was always perfectly styled, his green eyes sharp enough to cut glass, and his jaw strong enough to be carved from marble. He wore his power like a second skin, and his tailored suits probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Right away, sir," Lena replied, balancing the phone as she reached for the Morrison file, but as she stretched for it, her elbow caught the edge of her coffee mug, sending it teetering dangerously close to her keyboard. "I need those numbers before the call with—" "Yes, love. I mean Mr. Walker." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her hand shooting out to catch the mug, while her brain short-circuited in complete horror at what had just escaped her lips. Silence. The kind of silence that felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain it could be heard through the phone. Her coffee mug sat safely in her grip, but everything else felt like it was falling apart. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 5 minutes. The line went dead. Lena stared at the phone in her hand, as if it might explode. In 2 years of working for the most demanding man in New York, she had never, not once, made a mistake like this. She prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to maintain perfect composure, even when he was at his most impossible. And now she had called him love, as if Damian Walker, The man who once fired an entire department because their quarterly report was printed on the wrong paper weight would ever be anyone's love. As if the man who made billion-dollar decisions over breakfast and dismantled companies before lunch could be reduced to a term of endearment that slipped out like she was talking to her grandmother. Her hands shook as she gathered the Morrison files, her mind racing through potential damage control scenarios. An apology? A resignation letter? Maybe if she just pretended it never happened. But even as she tried to calm herself, something nagged at the back of her mind. In that moment of silence, that endless, terrifying silence, had she heard something? A sharp intake of breath? A pause that seemed less like anger and more like, no, that was impossible, wasn't it? What happens when the most guarded man in New York hears something he never expected? And why can't Lena shake the feeling that everything just changed forever? Sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when someone yells at you, it's when they don't. Lena's fingers trembled as she straightened the Morrison files for the third time in 30 seconds. The clock on her computer screen mocked her. 4 minutes and 47 seconds since the call ended. 43 seconds until she had to face the man she'd just called the most inappropriate thing imaginable. The elevator chimed in the distance, and she knew. Somehow she just knew those were his footsteps approaching, measured and deliberate, like everything else about Damian Walker. Her throat felt like sandpaper as she stood, smoothing down her navy pencil skirt and checking that every button on her cream silk blouse was perfectly aligned. The frosted glass doors swung open with more force than usual. Damian Walker filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his charcoal grey suit fitting his broad shoulders with the precision only money could buy. His jaw was set in that familiar line that usually meant someone was about to get fired, but something was different. His green eyes, normally cold as winter rain, seemed sharper somehow, more focused. "Mr. Walker," Lena began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I have the Morrison conference room. Now." He didn't look at her as he spoke, just strode past her desk toward the glass-walled meeting space that adjoined his office. Lena's stomach dropped to somewhere around her knees. The conference room was where careers went to die. It was where he delivered the kind of news that sent people packing their belongings into cardboard boxes. She gathered the files with hands that barely cooperated and followed him into what felt like her execution chamber. The room was all clean lines and intimidation. A massive mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of Manhattan that reminded everyone just how far they could fall. Damian stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he stared out at the city he'd conquered. Close the door. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Lena remained standing, files clutched to her chest like armor that wouldn't protect her from anything. "Sir, about what happened on the phone." "Sit." He still hadn't turned around. She chose the chair furthest from his usual spot at the head of the table, her heels clicking against the polished floor with each step. The silence stretched between them like a bridge made of glass, beautiful and terrifying, and ready to shatter at any moment. Finally he turned. Up close she could see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and impossible decisions. His dark hair was perfectly styled as always, but there was something in his expression she'd never seen before. Something that made her forget to breathe. "Do you know," he said slowly, his voice carrying that slight Queen's accent that only emerged when he was truly focused, "how many people have worked as my assistant in the past 5 years?" "No, sir." Her voice came out smaller than intended. 17. He moved to the chair across from her, not his usual position of power at the head of the table. "Do you know how long the longest one lasted?" Lena shook her head, not trusting her voice. 3 months. Janelle Morrison, no relation to the Morrison contract, made it exactly 92 days before she decided that working for me was, and I quote, "a form of psychological torture that violated her human rights." Despite everything, Lena felt her lips twitch slightly. She remembered Janelle, a perfectly competent woman who'd lasted longer than most, but had ultimately cracked under the pressure of Damian's impossibly high standards. "You've been here 2 years, Miss Carter." He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since she'd known him, his posture seemed almost relaxed. 2 years of handling my schedule, my calls, my moods, and my completely unreasonable demands. 2 years of arriving before me and leaving after me. 2 years of making this place run so smoothly I barely notice it's happening. "Sir, I'm not finished." But his tone wasn't harsh. It was something else entirely. In those 2 years, you have never once made a personal call on company time. You have never missed a deadline, never forgotten a meeting, never left a file out of place. You have been, in every measurable way, the perfect assistant. Lena felt heat creeping up her neck. This wasn't going where she'd expected. So when you call me, he paused, and something flickered across his features. Love instead of Mr. Walker. I have to ask myself why. The word hung in the air between them like a live wire. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was certain he could hear it. It was an accident, she whispered. A complete accident. I was reaching for my coffee, and I was distracted and... Were you thinking about someone else? The question hit her like cold water. What? When you said it? Were you thinking about someone else, a boyfriend? Someone you actually call... He seemed to struggle with the word. Love? Heat flooded her cheeks. No. There's no one. I mean, I wasn't thinking about anyone specifically. It just slipped out. The way people say hon or dear without thinking. It didn't mean anything. Something shifted in his expression. If she didn't know better, she might have thought it was disappointment. I see. He stood abruptly, smoothing down his tie, a nervous gesture she'd never seen from him before. Well, since it meant nothing, we can pretend it never happened. Yes, sir. Absolutely. It will never happen again. Good. But he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he stood there looking at her with an intensity that made her skin feel too small. The Morrison files? Right here. She held them up with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Leave them on my desk. And Miss Carter? Yes, sir? Next time you're about to spill coffee during a call, perhaps just set the mug down first. Was that almost a smile? Before she could be sure, he was gone, leaving her alone in the conference room with the strange feeling that something fundamental had just shifted beneath her feet. But why did his question about someone else feel less like an interrogation and more like hope? The most dangerous transformations happen so quietly, you don't notice until everything has already changed. 3 days had passed since the conference room conversation, and Lena was beginning to think she'd imagined the whole thing. Almost, if it weren't for the way Damien had started doing things that made absolutely no sense. Like right now, standing in her doorway at 11:47 a.m., with a cup of coffee in his hand. Not his usual black espresso, but something that smelled suspiciously like the vanilla latte she ordered from the cafe downstairs every morning. Miss Carter. His voice carried its usual professional tone, but there was something underneath it that made her look up from the quarterly report she'd been reviewing. Yes, Mr. Walker? He stepped into her space, and she noticed he'd rolled up his sleeves. It was such a small thing, but in 2 years she'd never seen Damien Walker with anything less than perfectly pressed cuffs and pristine suit jackets. The glimpse of his forearms, strong, defined, with a small scar just below his left elbow, felt oddly intimate. The Henderson proposal needs revisions before the board meeting. He placed the coffee cup on her desk, right next to her computer. I thought you might need fuel. Lena stared at the cup like it might explode. Sir? Coffee, he said, as if that explained anything. You drink coffee, I brought coffee. You brought me coffee? A slight flush crept up his neck, barely visible above his charcoal tie. The machine in my office was making that noise again. This was convenient. It was the worst lie she'd ever heard him tell, and Damien Walker was excellent at corporate manipulation when necessary. His office machine was state-of-the-art and serviced weekly. And even if it were broken, there were at least 4 other coffee stations between his office and the cafe downstairs. Thank you, she said carefully, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. It was exactly how she liked it. Extra vanilla, light foam, a touch of cinnamon. Details he couldn't possibly know unless he'd been paying attention to something that had nothing to do with business. The Henderson proposal, he repeated, but he didn't move away from her desk. Instead, he seemed to be studying the small succulent plant she'd placed next to her computer monitor. Is that new? The plant? Lena followed his gaze to the tiny jade green leaves. No, it's been there for months. Months, he repeated, like he was testing the word. I hadn't noticed. Damien Walker noticed everything. He could spot a misplaced comma in a 50-page contract and remember exactly which client preferred their coffee meetings at 2 p.m. instead of 2:15. The idea that he hadn't noticed something on his assistant's desk for months was impossible, unless he was lying about that too. It doesn't require much care, she found herself saying. Just a little water and sunlight. Like you. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel warm. Sir? He blinked, and the moment shattered like glass. I meant efficient. Low maintenance, like your work style. Oh, she took a sip of coffee to cover her disappointment, though she couldn't understand why she felt disappointed at all. Right. The Henderson proposal, he said for the third time, his voice back to its usual professional distance. 2 hours. Of course. But as he turned to leave, he paused at her doorway. Miss Carter? Yes? That coffee shop downstairs. Sterling's. Do you go there often? Heat bloomed in her cheeks. Sterling's was where she got her morning latte, her afternoon pick-me-up, and sometimes, when the day had been particularly brutal, her after-work comfort drink. It was also where she'd been going for 2 years, almost always at the same times, following patterns that someone could easily observe if they were paying attention. Most days, she admitted. Their pastries. Are they adequate? Lena bit back a smile. Adequate. As if Damien Walker had ever consumed anything adequate in his life. The blueberry scones are lovely. He nodded once sharply. Good to know. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with her vanilla latte and the strangest feeling that she'd just participated in a conversation that was about something else entirely. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Cassandra. Coffee later. Need to hear about your mysterious boss situation. Lena stared at the message, then at the coffee cup, then at the doorway where Damien had been standing. She typed back, Can't today, things are complicated. Oh, complicated how? Did he fire someone else? Please tell me you're not job hunting again. Lena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain that her infamously cold boss had just brought her coffee and asked about pastries like it was the most natural thing in the world? How could she describe the way he'd looked at her when he said, like you, in that low, rough voice that made her stomach flutter? No job hunting, she finally typed. Just busy, you're being weird. I'm bringing wine to your apartment tonight. Before Lena could protest, her computer chimed with an email. From Damien, sent exactly 43 seconds ago. Subject, Henderson proposal. Miss Carter, please review the attached revisions. Also, I've scheduled a working lunch in my office at 1 p.m. to discuss implementation strategies. I'll have Sterling's cater. D.W. Lena read the email twice, then a third time. In 2 years, Damien had never scheduled a working lunch that wasn't with clients or board members. He certainly had never had anything catered from the cafe downstairs, which he'd probably never even noticed before today. And he definitely had never signed an email with just his initials, like they were familiar. She looked at the coffee cup again, then at the tiny succulent he'd claimed not to notice for months, then at the email that felt more like an invitation than a business meeting. What was happening? Her phone buzzed again. Cassandra, definitely bringing wine and chocolate. You sound like you need both. As Lena stared at the message, she realized her best friend might be right. Because suddenly everything she thought she knew about her life, her job and her impossible boss, was shifting like sand beneath her feet. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't sure she wanted it to stop. Sometimes the most intimate conversations happen when you're pretending to talk about business. At exactly 1 p.m., Lena knocked on Damien's office door, her tablet loaded with Henderson proposal notes, and her stomach twisted in knots that had nothing to do with hunger. Come in. His office was a study in controlled power, floor-to-ceiling windows, a desk that could double as a landing strip, and enough expensive art to fund a small country. But today, something was different. The imposing mahogany desk had been cleared, and instead a small round table near the windows had been set with actual plates, real silverware, and cloth napkins that definitely hadn't come from Sterling's cafe. Damien stood with his back to her, jacket off, sleeves still rolled up from earlier. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the strong line of his shoulders, and Lena had to remind herself to breathe. Mr. Walker? I may have over-ordered, he said, without turning around. I wasn't sure what you preferred. When he finally faced her, Lena understood what he meant. What? The table looked like Sterling's entire menu had exploded across it. 3 different salads, 2 types of sandwiches, soup, the blueberry scones she'd mentioned, and what appeared to be every dessert option they offered. This is... She struggled for words. Very thorough. A flush crept up his neck. I wanted to make sure there were options. Options. As if this were a normal business lunch and not whatever this was turning into. Lena set her tablet on his desk and moved toward the table, hyper-aware of how he pulled out her chair like they were at some upscale restaurant instead of his corner office. Thank you. She settled into the seat, catching a hint of his cologne, something woodsy and expensive that made her want to lean closer. He sat across from her, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with something Lena couldn't name. "The Henderson proposal," she began, reaching for her tablet. "Can wait a moment." His voice was quieter than usual. "When was the last time you ate lunch?" The question caught her off guard. What? Lunch? An actual meal? Sitting down, not eating a granola bar at your desk while answering emails?" Lena felt heat creep up her cheeks. Had he noticed that too? "Yesterday, I think. Or Tuesday. It's Thursday. Is it?" She honestly wasn't sure anymore. The days had been blending together since the coffee incident, each one filled with meaningful looks and confusing gestures that made her question everything she thought she knew about her boss. Eat. It wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't a suggestion either. Please. The please made her stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with hunger. She reached for the closest salad, mixed greens with strawberries and what looked like goat cheese, and tried to ignore the way he watched her every movement. "This is really good," she said after the first bite, and his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. "I'm glad." He served himself some of the pasta salad, but she noticed he barely touched it. "Miss Carter, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why don't you ever take lunch breaks?" She paused, fork halfway to her mouth. "I do take lunch breaks. Granola bars don't count. Sometimes they're protein bars," she said with a small smile, and was rewarded with something that might have been an almost laugh. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." She set down her fork, considering. "I suppose I've never felt like I could step away. This job working for you, it requires total focus, and I've seen what happens to people who don't give that. You think I'd fire you for taking 30 minutes to eat a proper meal? I think," she chose her words carefully, "I think you have very high standards, and I never want to fall short of them." Something shifted in his expression. "Have I ever given you reason to think you've fallen short?" "No," she admitted, "never." "Then why?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. Because admitting that she worked through lunch because leaving her desk meant missing his calls felt too vulnerable. Because explaining that she'd rather eat granola bars than risk disappointing him sounded dangerously close to caring too much. "I suppose I'm a perfectionist," she said finally. "So am I." His green eyes held hers steadily. "And in my experience, perfection requires sustainability. Burning yourself out serves no one." "Is that what you think I'm doing? Burning out?" "I think," he said slowly, "that you take care of everyone except yourself." The observation hit her like a physical blow, not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right, and she'd never expected Damien Walker to notice something so personal about her life. "That's not—" She started to protest, then stopped. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been watching you for 2 years. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "I see how you stay late to make sure everything's perfect for the next day. I see how you remember everyone's birthdays, how you know exactly how each board member likes their coffee, how you somehow manage to solve problems before I even know they exist. But when's the last time someone took care of you?" The question made her throat tight. "I don't need anyone to take care of me." "Everyone needs someone to take care of them." His voice was so gentle it made her chest ache. "Even you." "Even you?" she asked without thinking. The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a long moment he was quiet, staring down at his untouched pasta salad like it held the secrets of the universe. "I used to think I didn't," he said finally. "I used to think needing people was weakness, that caring about anyone made you vulnerable. Used to." He looked up and the vulnerability in his eyes made her breath catch. "Things change." "What changed?" "You called me love." The words were barely above a whisper, and for the first time in 20 years, I wanted someone to mean it. The admission hung in the air between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric and impossible to ignore. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at him, at this man who'd just revealed something she was certain he'd never told another living soul. "Mr. Walker, Damien." His voice was rough. "When we're alone like this, please, just Damien." The way he said his own name like he was offering her something precious made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "Damien," she repeated softly, and watched something beautiful and terrifying unfold across his features. But what happens when the walls finally come down? And why does the most powerful man in New York suddenly look like he's holding his breath? The most dangerous moment isn't when someone shows you their armor. It's when they show you their scars. The rest of the lunch passed in a haze of careful conversation and stolen glances. They talked about the Henderson proposal, about quarterly projections, about anything that wasn't the way Damien's name had sounded when she said it, or the way his eyes had darkened when she did. By the time Lena returned to her desk at 2:30, her hands were shaking, and her mind was spinning like a carousel that had lost its brakes. Just Damien. She'd never called him that before, had never even thought his first name without the protective barrier of Mr. Walker attached to it. But the way it had rolled off her tongue, soft and familiar like she'd been saying it her whole life, her phone buzzed with a text from Cassandra. Wine and chocolate ETA 7 p.m. Prepare for interrogation. Lena stared at the message, then at her computer screen where 17 new emails waited for her attention. None of them seemed important compared to the way Damien had looked at her when he'd said he wanted someone to mean it when they called him love. The elevator chimed, and her stomach fluttered as footsteps approached. But it wasn't Damien. It was Trevor from marketing, carrying a stack of presentation boards and wearing the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Is he in?" Trevor asked, nodding toward Damien's office. "Yes, but I'll just be a minute. Board wants these revised projections for tomorrow's meeting." Before Lena could stop him, Trevor was knocking on Damien's door. She heard the muffled "come in" and watched through the glass as Trevor entered the office, closing the door behind him. For 15 minutes, she tried to focus on her emails, but the conversation in Damien's office seemed to be growing more animated. Not quite shouting, but definitely not the calm, controlled discussion that usually characterized his meetings. Finally, the door flew open, and Trevor emerged, looking like he'd been through a windstorm. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie askew, and his face was flushed with what looked like barely contained frustration. "Good luck with that," he muttered to Lena as he passed her desk. "Whatever's got him wound up today, it's not the projections." Lena watched him disappear into the elevator, then looked toward Damien's office. Through the glass, she could see him standing with his back to the door, hands braced against his desk, shoulders rigid with tension. Something was wrong. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. When he still hadn't moved from that position, she gathered her courage and knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Walker, is everything all right?" "Fine." His voice was clipped, professional. The warmth from lunch had vanished like it had never existed. But he wasn't fine. Even through the frosted glass, she could see the tension in every line of his body. "The Morrison contract requires your signature," she said, using the excuse of the file folder in her hand. "Leave it on the desk." "Sir, just leave it." The words stung more than they should have. An hour ago, he'd asked her to call him Damien. Now, he wouldn't even look at her. Lena pushed open the door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. What happened? Finally, he turned. His face was a mask of the cold professionalism she remembered from her first days working for him, but his eyes looked haunted. "Nothing that concerns you, Miss Carter." Miss Carter, not Lena. Not the gentle way he'd said her name during lunch. The formal distance felt like a slap. Trevor looked upset when he left. "Trevor's incompetence is not your problem, but yours is." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Damien's eyebrows rose, and for a moment she thought he might fire her on the spot. "Excuse me? I said your problems are mine." She lifted her chin, surprised by her own boldness. "That's what an assistant does. We handle problems so you don't have to carry them alone. This isn't a scheduling conflict or a misplaced contract, Miss Carter." "Then what is it?" He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out across his features, the urge to shut her out, battling against something else, something that looked almost like relief at having someone ask. "The board," he said finally, sinking into his chair like the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. "They're questioning my judgment. Again. About the Henderson deal? About everything." He rubbed his temples, and she noticed for the first time how tired he looked. "My leadership style, my decision-making, my personal life." "Your personal life?" The words came out sharper than she intended. "Apparently, some of the board members have noticed that I've been different lately. More distracted, less focused on what they consider priorities." Lena's stomach dropped. "Different how?" He looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his green eyes made her breath catch. "They think I'm losing my edge, getting soft. That's ridiculous." "Is it?" He stood abruptly, moving to the windows that overlooked the city. "Because they might be right. I've been making decisions based on factors that have nothing to do with profit margins or market shares." "What factors?" "Whether my assistant has eaten lunch, whether she's working too hard, whether she feels appreciated." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Whether calling someone love by accident might actually mean something. The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying in its implications. "Damien," she moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. "Don't." He didn't turn around. "Don't make this harder than it already is." "Make what harder?" "Walking away from this, from whatever this is becoming." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Is that what you want? To walk away?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded like grief. "What I want, and what I can afford, are two very different things. I built this company from nothing, Lena. I've sacrificed everything, relationships, friendships, any chance at a normal life, to get here. I can't lose it now, because I've suddenly developed feelings for your assistant," she finished when he trailed off, "for the most extraordinary woman I've ever met." He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her knees weak. "Who happens to be my assistant?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at him, at this powerful man who just laid his soul bare in front of her. "So, what happens now?" she whispered. "Now," he said, straightening his tie and rebuilding his walls in real time, "we go back to the way things were. Professional, appropriate, safe." But even as he said it, the way he looked at her suggested that going back might be the most impossible thing he'd ever attempted. How do you unlearn someone's name once you've tasted it on your tongue? And why does doing the right thing feel so much like giving up everything that matters? Some distances can't be measured in feet or miles. The hardest ones to cross are measured in heartbeats. For 3 days, Damien Walker became a ghost. Not literally, of course. He was still there, arriving at 7 a.m. sharp, taking his calls, reviewing contracts with the same meticulous attention to detail that had built his empire. But the man who had brought her coffee and asked about blueberry scones might as well have evaporated. Lena sat at her desk Thursday morning, staring at the email that had arrived at exactly 6:47 a.m. "Miss Carter, please schedule the Morrison follow-up for Friday at 3 p.m. Conference Room A. I'll handle the catering arrangements myself. Regards, D. Walker." Regards. Not even the courtesy of his full signature. And catering arrangements, as if the thought of sharing another meal with her was too dangerous to risk. She'd read the email 17 times, looking for some hint of the man who had said her name like a prayer just days ago. But there was nothing. Just cold professionalism wrapped in corporate speak. Her phone rang, jarring her from her brooding. "Good morning, Mr. Walker's office. Lena, it's Cassandra. Please tell me you're free for an emergency lunch because I'm having a crisis and I need my best friend to talk me off the ledge." Despite everything, Lena found herself smiling. Cassandra Hayes had been her anchor since college, the kind of friend who showed up with wine when you were heartbroken and ice cream when you got promoted. She was also completely incapable of having a crisis that wasn't at least mildly dramatic. "What kind of crisis?" Lena asked, keeping her voice low. "The kind that involves my mother asking when I'm going to settle down with a nice accountant, and me realizing I've been dating the same commitment-phobic artist for 2 years, with nothing to show for it, except a collection of abstract paintings I don't understand. That does sound crisis-worthy. Right, so lunch, that little bistro on 5th? Lena hesitated, glancing toward Damien's closed office door. In the old days, before coffee and confessions and the way he'd said her name, she would have automatically declined. But something rebellious sparked in her chest. If he wanted professional distance, she could give him professional distance, including a proper lunch break. "Noon," she said. "I'll meet you there." "Perfect. And Lena, bring details about whatever's been making you sound weird lately. I have theories." The line went dead before Lena could protest that she hadn't been sounding weird, though considering she'd spent the last 3 days jumping every time her phone rang and analyzing emails for subtext that probably didn't exist. Maybe Cassandra had a point. At 11:58 a.m., Lena knocked on Damien's door to inform him she was taking lunch. The response that came back was muffled, professional, and completely lacking in the warmth she'd grown accustomed to. "Fine. Be back by 1:30. No questions about where she was going. No reminders to actually eat something substantial. Just corporate efficiency wrapped in indifference. The bistro was exactly what she needed. Warm, bustling, and far enough from Meridian Tower that she could pretend she was just a normal person having lunch with her best friend, instead of a woman whose heart did gymnastics every time her boss so much as looked in her direction. Cassandra was already seated at a corner table, her wild auburn curls barely contained by what appeared to be a vintage scarf, her artistic sensibilities on full display in a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than Lena's monthly rent. "You look terrible," Cassandra announced, as Lena slid into the opposite chair. "Hello to you, too. I'm serious. You have that pinched look you get when you're overthinking something to death. What's going on?" Lena picked up her menu, avoiding her friend's too perceptive gaze. "Nothing's going on. Work has been busy." "Uh-huh. And I'm sure this has nothing to do with the mysterious text messages you've been sending for the past week. Things are complicated. Can't explain right now. Everything is fine, but also terrifying. Ring any bells?" "I never said everything was terrifying. You didn't have to. It was implied." Cassandra leaned forward, her brown eyes sharp with concern. "Lena, what happened?" For a moment, Lena considered lying, making up some story about difficult clients or impossible deadlines. But the weight of the past week, the confusion, the hope, the crushing disappointment of watching Damien retreat behind his walls, suddenly felt too heavy to carry alone. "I think I might be falling for my boss," she said quietly. Cassandra blinked. Once. Twice. Then her face split into a grin that could have powered half of Manhattan. "Finally, I knew it. I've been waiting 2 years for you to admit you have feelings for the Ice King." "You knew?" "Honey, you've been defending that man's honor since your second week on the job. Every time someone called him heartless or impossible, you'd get this look. Like you wanted to explain that they just didn't understand him. Plus, you know his coffee order by heart, and not just the basics. You know he takes exactly 2 sugars, not 1, not 3, and that he prefers his morning espresso slightly cooler than his afternoon one." Heat flooded Lena's cheeks. "That's just being observant. That's just being in love. The question is, does he feel the same way?" Lena's chest tightened. "It doesn't matter." "Of course it matters. It's the only thing that matters." "No, it's not." Lena set down her menu, her appetite vanishing. "Even if he did feel the same way, which I'm not saying he does, there are rules, policies, professional boundaries that exist for good reasons. Since when do you care about breaking rules?" "Since my entire career could be destroyed if this goes wrong." Cassandra studied her for a long moment, her expression growing serious. "What aren't you telling me?" Lena opened her mouth to deflect, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "He brought me coffee and lunch, and he asked me to call him by his first name, and for about 5 minutes I thought maybe something was happening, but then he pulled away, and now he won't even look at me, and I feel like an idiot for thinking it could be anything more than—" "Wait," Cassandra held up a hand. "He asked you to call him by his first name?" "Yes. Damien Walker, the man who makes executives cry for sport, asked his assistant to use his first name. It wasn't like that. It was private, quiet, like he was giving me something precious." Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "And then what happened?" "He decided it was a mistake, that we needed to maintain professional distance." "And you believed him? What else was I supposed to do?" "Fight for it." Cassandra's voice was fierce. "Fight for him, for what you feel. I can't risk my job, Cass. I won't. This position, this company, it's everything I've worked for. And what about what your heart worked for?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Lena found herself thinking about the way Damien had looked at her when he'd called her extraordinary, the way his voice had broken when he'd admitted he wanted someone to mean it when they called him love. But wanting something and having it were 2 very different things, weren't they? The heart has its own gravity. The more you try to pull away, the stronger the pull becomes. Lena returned from lunch at exactly 1:27 p.m., Cassandra's words echoing in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. Fight for it. Fight for him. But as she settled back at her desk and saw the stack of files that had mysteriously appeared while she was gone, each tagged with Damien's precise handwriting and urgent deadlines, the reality of her situation crashed back down around her. This was her job, her livelihood, her carefully constructed professional life that she'd built one perfect day at a time. She couldn't just throw it all away for feelings that might not even be reciprocated, could she? Her computer chimed with a new email, from Damien, of course, sent at 1:15 p.m. while she was still listening to Cassandra's impassioned speech about following her heart. Subject, quarterly reports. Miss Carter, the attached reports require immediate attention. Please have the Morrison analysis completed by end of day and reschedule tomorrow's 10 a.m. with Hartwell Industries. Something has come up. D. Walker, P.S. I trust your lunch was satisfactory. Lena stared at the postscript until the words blurred. Such a small thing. 5 words that could mean nothing. or could mean that he'd been thinking about her while she was gone, that he cared whether she'd eaten something besides granola bars, or maybe she was reading too much into corporate politeness. She was still staring at the screen when her phone rang. Mr. Walker's office. Lena Carter. The voice was unfamiliar, crisp and professional, with a slight southern accent. Speaking. This is Bethany Morrison from Morrison Industries. I'm calling about the contract meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Lena pulled up her calendar, frowning. I don't show any meeting with Morrison Industries tomorrow, Ms. Morrison. Are you perhaps thinking of the Henderson proposal? No, definitely Morrison Industries. Mr. Walker personally called my father this morning to schedule an urgent meeting about expanding our partnership. Didn't he tell you? A cold weight settled in Lena's stomach. In 2 years, Damien had never scheduled a meeting without going through her. It was one of his cardinal rules. Everything went through his assistant. No exceptions. The fact that he'd made a call himself, arranged a meeting she knew nothing about. Let me check his calendar, she said, buying time while her mind raced. What time were you expecting to meet? 2 p.m. My father's flying in from Atlanta specifically for this. Of course, I'll confirm the details with Mr. Walker and get back to you. Thank you. And Lena? My father mentioned that Mr. Walker seemed quite eager to move forward quickly on this. Almost urgent, actually. Is everything all right? No, Lena thought. Nothing is all right. Everything's fine, she heard herself say. I'll call you back within the hour. After hanging up, Lena sat in the silence of her office, pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve clicking into place. Damien scheduling secret meetings, the sudden pile of urgent files, his request to reschedule the Hartwell meeting. It felt like he was preparing for something, or preparing to leave something behind. Before she could lose her nerve, she stood and walked to his office door. This time she didn't knock. Mr. Walker? He looked up from his computer, and for just a moment, his professional mask slipped. She saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, tension in the set of his shoulders, and something else, something that looked almost like relief at seeing her. Miss Carter, I wasn't expecting... Bethany Morrison called. She stepped into his office and closed the door behind her. About the meeting you scheduled for tomorrow, the one you didn't tell me about. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I can handle my own schedule when necessary. In 2 years, you've never handled your own scheduling. Not once. Perhaps it's time I started becoming more self-sufficient. The words hit her like a slap. Self-sufficient, as in he didn't need her anymore, as in he was already planning her exit from his life. Is that what this is about? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. You're trying to push me out? I'm trying to maintain appropriate professional boundaries by cutting me out of your professional life entirely, by doing what's necessary. For who? The question exploded out of her before she could stop it. For the company? For your reputation? Or for you? He stood slowly, his hands braced on his desk like he needed the support. For both of us. Don't. She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his green eyes, close enough to catch that woodsy scent of his cologne. Don't make decisions for me. Don't decide what I can and can't handle. You don't understand what you're asking. Then explain it to me. I can't. His voice was rough, strained. I can't be in the same room with you and pretend I don't feel what I feel. I can't watch you being perfect and professional and extraordinary and not want things I have no right to want. What things? He closed his eyes like the question caused him physical pain. Everything. I want everything with you, and it's destroying my ability to think clearly. The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and honest and completely devastating in its vulnerability. Then why are you pushing me away? Because I've seen what happens when people like me get involved with people like you. People like me? Good people, honest people. People who deserve better than someone whose entire life is built on calculated risks and hostile takeovers. That's not who you are. It's exactly who I am. He opened his eyes, and the pain in them made her chest ache. I'm a man who fires people without blinking, who destroys companies for profit, who hasn't maintained a meaningful relationship in 20 years because I'm incapable of putting anyone before the business. But you put me before the business, she said softly. When you brought me coffee, when you asked about my lunch, when you said my name like it mattered to you. And look where that got us. Where did it get us, Damien? The sound of his name seemed to break something inside him. He moved around the desk, closing the distance between them until they were standing close enough to touch, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. It got us here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Standing in my office, pretending we can go back to the way things were when we both know it's impossible. Then don't go back. Lena, don't go back. Don't push me away. Don't make decisions about my life without asking me what I want. What do you want? The question was simple, but the weight of it, the implications, the possibilities, the terrifying hope in his eyes, made it feel like the most important question anyone had ever asked her. I want, she said, her heart hammering against her ribs, to know what happens if we stop being afraid. But some questions change everything, and once they're asked, there's no going back to the safety of not knowing the answer. Some moments are so fragile they could shatter with a whisper. Others are so strong they could survive an earthquake. The silence that followed Lena's question stretched between them like a tightrope, dangerous and beautiful and impossible to cross safely. Damien stared at her, his green eyes searching her face as if he could find the answer to everything that terrified him written in her expression. You don't know what you're asking, he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear it. I know exactly what I'm asking. Lena! Her name came out like a prayer, like a warning, like a man drowning and finding air all at once. What happens if we stop being afraid? She repeated, stepping closer until there was barely a breath of space between them. What happens if we stop pretending this is just professional courtesy and start admitting that it's something else entirely? His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. What happens is that everything changes. Everything. I know. Your job, your career, the life you've built here. I know. People will talk. They'll say things about you that aren't true, and things about me that are. His voice was rough with pain and honesty. They'll question your competence, your integrity, your worth. They'll make you regret ever meeting me. Let me worry about what I can handle. I can't protect you from the fallout of being with me. I'm not asking you to protect me, I'm asking you to trust me. Something shifted in his expression, something vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not who you think I am? What if you are? The question seemed to break the last of his resistance. His forehead dropped against hers, and for a moment they just breathed the same air, existing in the small space between possibility and certainty. I've never felt this way about anyone, he whispered against her skin. I don't know how to do this without destroying it. Then we learn together. He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, and what she saw there made her heart stop. Wanton fear and something so tender it made her throat tight with unshed tears. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no going back. Not to the way things were. Not to professional distance and polite conversations about quarterly reports. Good, she breathed. I never want to go back. Lena. He seemed to be memorizing her face, cataloguing every detail like he was afraid she might disappear. What if this is a mistake? What if it's not? What if I'm not enough? What if I'm too damaged, too selfish, too... She silenced him the only way she could think of, by reaching up and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, a question rather than a demand. But the moment their lips touched, something electric shot through her entire body, like coming home and falling off a cliff all at the same time. For a heartbeat, Damien went completely still. Then his arms came around her, pulling her against him like she was oxygen, and he'd been drowning, and he kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of weeks of wanting and fighting, and finally, giving in. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were dark with something that looked like wonder. That, he said unsteadily, was not professional. No, she agreed, her lips still tingling from the contact. It really wasn't. My assistant just kissed me in my office. Actually, I think your assistant just kissed a man named Damien. Mr. Walker would never allow such behavior. The smile that spread across his face was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, genuine and warm and completely transformative. This wasn't the cold, controlled CEO the rest of the world knew. This was just Damien, looking at her like she'd just given him something he'd never dared hope for. You're going to be the death of my professional reputation, he said, but there was no regret in his voice. Only affection and amazement and something that might have been relief. I'm going to be a lot of things to you, she said, surprised by her own boldness, but your downfall isn't one of them. How can you be so sure? Because, she said, reaching up to straighten his tie, a gesture so intimate and domestic it made his breath catch. I've been watching you for 2 years. I've seen how brilliant you are, how dedicated, how much you care about this company even when you pretend you don't care about anything. And I know that whatever this is between us, it's not going to make you weak, it's going to make you stronger. You have more faith in me than I do. Then let me have enough for both of us, until you catch up. He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the exact instant when his last wall came down, when he stopped fighting and started believing. Dinner, he said suddenly. What? Have dinner with me? Tonight? Not Sterling's catering, not a working lunch. A real dinner, where we talk about anything except quarterly reports and contract negotiations. That sounds suspiciously like a date, Mr. Walker. That's because it is a date, Miss Carter. His smile was soft and real and completely devastating. Our first official date, if you'll have me. I'll have to check my calendar, she said solemnly. I might be busy doing my boss's scheduling, since he apparently can't be trusted to handle his own appointments. Your boss, he said, pulling her closer, is going to have to learn to delegate more effectively, starting with delegating his complete and undivided attention to the most important person in his life. And who would that be? The woman who called me love by accident and changed everything. What if it wasn't an accident? The question slipped out before she could stop it, honest and vulnerable and completely terrifying in its implications. Damien's eyes widened, and for a moment she thought she might have pushed too far, revealed too much. But then his smile returned, soft and wondering, and full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Then, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I guess we both got exactly what we needed, even when we didn't know we needed it. But first dates between bosses and assistants require more than just hope and good intentions. And sometimes the biggest obstacle isn't the world outside. It's learning to trust that happiness is something you're actually allowed to have. The most terrifying and wonderful thing about new beginnings is that they require you to become someone you've never been before. Lena changed her outfit 4 times before settling on a navy blue dress that struck the delicate balance between professional enough not to feel completely foreign and feminine enough to remind herself and Damien that this was decidedly not a business meeting. As she applied a final coat of lip gloss in the mirror of her Greenwich Village apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from Cassandra. Details. ASAP. Don't make me hunt you down. Another buzz, this time from an unknown number. Looking forward to tonight. The simple message made her stomach flutter with nerves and anticipation. Damien Walker, her boss, her impossible, complicated, wonderful boss, had asked her on a date, and in approximately 30 minutes, she was going to find out what the man behind the corporate armor was like when he wasn't running an empire. The restaurant he'd chosen was a small Italian place in Soho, the kind of intimate spot with exposed brick walls and candlelit tables that felt a million miles away from the glass and steel world of Meridian Tower. Lena arrived exactly on time, a habit ingrained by 2 years of managing Damien's impossibly precise schedule, and found him already seated at a corner table, looking unfairly handsome in dark jeans and a charcoal sweater that made his green eyes even more striking. He stood when he saw her, and the smile that spread across his face was worth every moment of wardrobe uncertainty. You look beautiful, he said simply, pulling out her chair with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. Thank you. She settled into her seat, hyper-aware of how different this felt from their lunch in his office. Here, in the warm glow of candlelight, with soft jazz playing in the background and no quarterly reports in sight, he looked younger somehow, softer. I have to admit, he said as he sat across from her, I wasn't entirely sure you'd show up. Having second thoughts about dating your assistant? Having second thoughts about whether I deserve someone like you. The honesty in his voice made her chest tight. Damien, sorry. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd never seen in the office. I'm not very good at this. It's been a while since I've been on a date that wasn't a business dinner in disguise. How long is a while? He considered the question seriously. 3 years, maybe 4. The last woman I dated told me I was emotionally unavailable and suggested I seek professional help. Was she right? Probably. His smile was self-deprecating. Though in my defense, I was in the middle of acquiring a company in Singapore and sleeping about 3 hours a night. And now? Now I'm sitting across from a woman who makes me want to be the kind of man who remembers to ask about her day and notices when she changes her hair. Lena touched her hair self-consciously. She'd worn it down tonight, loose curls framing her face instead of the sleek bun she favored at work. You noticed? I notice everything about you. It's becoming a problem. Before she could respond, their server appeared. A young man with an easy smile who clearly recognized Damien, but was professional enough not to make a scene about it. Good evening. Can I start you with something to drink? Wine? Damien asked Lena. Red, if you don't mind. A bottle of the Chianti Classico, Damien told the server, "and we'll need a few more minutes with the menu." As the server disappeared, Lena found herself studying Damien's face in the candlelight. Without the formal barrier of his office and his perfectly pressed suits, she could see details she'd never noticed before. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the faint stubble that suggested he'd actually left work early enough to go home and change. "What?" he asked, catching her stare. "I'm trying to reconcile this version of you with the man who made Trevor from marketing look like he'd seen a ghost yesterday." Damien winced. Trevor deserved that. His projections were sloppy and he tried to blame it on the interns. "So you eviscerated him." "I gave him constructive feedback with a flamethrower." It was a very small flamethrower. His grin was boyish and completely at odds with his reputation. "Are you going to spend our entire first date defending my employees? Are you going to spend our entire first date terrifying them?" "Fair point." He reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. "No work talk. Tell me something I don't know about you." "Like what?" "Anything, everything. What did you want to be when you grew up? What's your favorite movie? What makes you laugh?" The questions came rapid fire, like he'd been storing them up for months, and was finally allowed to ask. Lena felt herself relaxing for the first time in days. "A teacher," she said. "Pride and Prejudice. The 1995 version, obviously, and terrible puns. The worse they are, the funnier I find them." "A teacher. Elementary school. I wanted to be the kind of teacher who made kids excited about learning, who noticed when someone was struggling and helped them find their way." "What changed?" Lena was quiet for a moment, thinking about college loans and practical decisions, and the way life sometimes took you in directions you never planned. "Reality, I suppose. Teaching jobs were scarce, and I had student loans to pay. When the opportunity at Walker Investments came up, it seemed like a smart move." "Do you regret it?" "No," she said, and realized she meant it. "If I'd become a teacher, I never would have met you." The wine arrived, providing a momentary distraction as they went through the ritual of tasting and approval. But when they were alone again, Damien's eyes held a warmth that made her feel like the most important person in the room. "Your turn," she said. "What did little Damien Walker want to be when he grew up?" "A carpenter." The answer was so unexpected that Lena nearly choked on her wine. "A carpenter? My grandfather was a furniture maker. He had this workshop in Queens, and I used to spend summers with him, learning to work with my hands. There's something satisfying about taking raw materials and creating something beautiful and functional." "That's not what I expected." "I know. Hard to imagine now." He gestured at himself, at the expensive watch and perfectly groomed appearance. "But I still have some of his tools. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I go to my workshop and build something." "You have a workshop?" "Top floor of my building. My neighbors probably think I'm insane, but there's something therapeutic about sanding wood at 2 in the morning." Lena tried to picture it. Damien Walker, corporate titan, working with his hands, sawdust in his hair, creating something just for the joy of it. The image was surprisingly easy to conjure and surprisingly appealing. "What do you build?" "Furniture, mostly. Bookshelves, coffee tables. I made a rocking chair last year that I've never had anyone to give it to." "Until now." The words slipped out before she could stop them, bold and presumptuous and full of implications about a future they'd only just started to imagine. But Damien's smile was soft and sure. "Until now. But first dates are just the beginning, and building something real requires more than good intentions and shared wine. Sometimes the hardest part isn't falling in love, it's learning to believe you're worthy of being loved in return. The moment when everything you've built either stands or falls isn't when you're tested by strangers, it's when you're tested by the truth." 3 weeks after their first date, Lena was beginning to believe that happiness might actually be something she was allowed to have. It had been 3 weeks of stolen moments between meetings, of coffee that tasted better when Damien brought it, of working late, not because she had to, but because it meant more time in his presence. 3 weeks of discovering that the man who terrified corporate executives spent his Saturday mornings building furniture and his Sunday afternoons reading poetry. 3 weeks of falling so completely in love that she sometimes forgot to breathe when he looked at her. They'd been careful, professional during business hours, discreet about their evening dinners, cautious about not letting their personal relationship affect the workplace. It had been perfect. Until Monday morning, when everything fell apart. Lena arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m. to find Damien already at his desk, but something was wrong. His usual composure had been replaced by a tension so palpable she could feel it from her doorway. "Good morning," she said carefully, setting his coffee on his desk. He looked up, and the expression in his green eyes made her stomach drop. This wasn't the warm look she'd grown accustomed to, or even the professional distance of their early days. This was something else entirely, something that looked like betrayal. "We need to talk." His voice was cold, formal. "Conference room. Now." The walk to the conference room felt like a death march. Damien's jaw was set in the hard line she remembered from her first days working for him, and he hadn't looked at her once since his initial devastated glance. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized as his preparing for battle stance. "Sit down, Miss Carter." Miss Carter, not Lena. The formal address felt like a slap. "Damien, what's—" "Sit down." She sat, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. Whatever was happening, it was bad. Worse than bad. He remained standing, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. "How long? How long what? How long have you been feeding information to Meridian's competitors?" The question hit her like a physical blow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was actually asking her. "What?" "Don't." His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. 3 separate deals have fallen through in the past month because our competitors somehow knew exactly what our offers were going to be. Deals that only a handful of people had access to. Damien, I would never— The Henderson proposal, the Morrison expansion, the Hartwell acquisition." He began pacing, his controlled fury filling the room like smoke, all of them sabotaged by competitors who somehow had inside information. Information that could only have come from someone with access to my files, my calendar, my private conversations. Lena felt the blood drain from her face. "You think I'm corporate espionage?" "I think," he said, stopping directly in front of her, "that I've been played by an expert, and I think I was stupid enough to fall for it. That's not what this is." She stood, desperate to close the distance between them, but he stepped back like her proximity was dangerous. "Damien, you know me. You know I would never betray you or this company." "Do I? Because 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew you. I thought you were honest, loyal, trustworthy. But 3 weeks ago, you also started asking questions about deals that weren't in your usual purview, started showing up early, staying late, having access to information you never needed before. Because we were together more. Because you were including me in things you'd never included me in before. Convenient, wasn't it?" His smile was cold and bitter. "The timing, the way you suddenly became interested in me right around the time these leaks started happening." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "You think I seduced you for corporate secrets? I think you called me love by accident and saw an opportunity. That's not—" Her voice broke. "You know that's not what happened." "Do I?" "Because I've been going over every conversation we've had, every moment, every touch, and I can't tell anymore what was real and what was performance." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not when he was looking at her like she was something toxic he'd accidentally touched. "The workshop," she said desperately. "The rocking chair. Your grandfather. The poetry. Was all of that performance too?" Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or regret, but it was gone too quickly to be sure. "Maybe it was," he said quietly. "Maybe I wanted to believe in something so badly that I created it out of nothing. Or maybe," she said, her voice stronger now, steadier, "you're so terrified of being vulnerable that you'd rather believe I'm a corporate spy than accept that someone could actually love you." The word hung between them like a live wire. Love. She'd said it without thinking, without planning, but now that it was out there, she realized it was the truest thing she'd ever spoken. "Love," he repeated, and the way he said it made it sound like profanity. "Yes, love. The thing you said you wanted someone to mean when they called you that. Well, here it is. I love you. I love your terrible jokes and your perfectionist tendencies and the way you remember how everyone likes their coffee. I love that you build furniture at 2 in the morning, and that you still have your grandfather's tools. I love that you pretend to be heartless when you're actually the most caring man I've ever met. Stop. I love that you brought me coffee and worried about my lunch and made me feel like I mattered for the first time in my professional life. And if you think any of that was an act, if you think I'm capable of faking the way I feel when you look at me," I said stop, "then you don't know me at all." The silence that followed was deafening. Damien stared at her, his chest rising and falling like he'd been running, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Someone is leaking information," he said finally. Someone close to me, someone I trust. If it's not you, it's not me. Then who? I don't know, but we'll figure it out. Together. There is no together. The words came out flat, final. There can't be. Not anymore. Because you think I betrayed you? Because I can't trust my own judgment anymore. His voice broke on the admission. I can't tell the difference between what I want to be true and what actually is true. And that makes me dangerous. To the company, to myself, to you. So you're just going to throw this away, throw us away. There is no us. There was a mistake, a moment of weakness, a lapse in professional judgment. Nothing more. Each word was a knife to her chest. But Lena forced herself to stay standing, to keep breathing, to not let him see how completely he was destroying her. Fine, she said quietly, if that's what you need to believe. It's not about what I need to believe, it's about reality. Reality? She nodded once, sharply. And what reality is that exactly? That you're incapable of love, that anyone who claims to care about you must have ulterior motives, that you're so fundamentally unworthy of happiness that you'll sabotage it the moment it appears. Yes, the simple, honest answer broke her heart more completely than all his accusations combined. Then I feel sorry for you, she said softly, because you're choosing to be alone. You're choosing to believe the worst about someone who loves you. And you're choosing to throw away the best thing that's ever happened to either of us because you're too scared to fight for it. She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. When you figure out who's really betraying you, she said without turning around, I hope you remember this conversation. I hope you remember that you had someone who would have stood by you through anything, and you chose to push her away instead. Lena, Miss Carter, she corrected, and finally let him hear the pain in her voice. If we're going back to professional distance, let's do it properly. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when we're desperate to keep it buried. And some mistakes can't be undone, no matter how much we wish we could take back the words that shattered everything. 6 months later. Sometimes the longest journey isn't between two places. It's between who you were and who you're brave enough to become. The small cafe in Brooklyn Heights had become Lena's sanctuary over the past 6 months. Tucked away from the glass towers of Manhattan, it was the kind of place where she could disappear into her laptop and her thoughts without worrying about running into anyone from her old life. She'd found a job 3 weeks after leaving Walker Investments, administrative coordinator for a non-profit that provided educational resources to underserved communities. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly didn't pay what she was used to, but for the first time in 2 years, she went to bed each night knowing that her work had made someone's life a little bit better. Teaching, in a way, just like she'd always wanted. The cafe door chimed, and Lena looked up from her laptop where she'd been reviewing grant applications. Her breath caught in her throat. Damien Walker stood in the doorway, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. Gone was the perfectly pressed suit and commanding presence. Instead, he wore dark jeans and a simple grey sweater, his hair slightly mussed, like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked tired, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly handsome. Their eyes met across the crowded cafe, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared. He approached her table slowly, like he was afraid she might bolt if he moved too quickly. Lena, Damien. Her voice was steadier than she felt. How did you find me? Cassandra. He gestured to the empty chair across from her. May I? She nodded, not trusting her voice. He sat down, and she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. You look good, he said quietly. Happy. I am happy. It wasn't entirely true. There was a Damien-shaped hole in her chest that hadn't healed, but it wasn't entirely false either. What are you doing here? I came to apologize, and to tell you the truth. The truth? The leak wasn't you. It was never you. He looked down at his hands, and she could see the shame in every line of his body. It was Beverly from accounting. She'd been feeding information to her boyfriend, who worked for one of our competitors. We caught them 2 months ago. 2 months. The timeline hit her like a slap. You've known for 2 months that I was innocent, and you're just telling me now? I wanted to tell you immediately. I tried to call, to email, to... He stopped, took a breath. But I realized that apologizing for accusing you of corporate espionage was the easy part. The hard part was apologizing for the real reason I pushed you away, which was fear. The word came out barely above a whisper. Pure paralyzing fear that someone like you could actually love someone like me. Lena felt her chest tighten. Damien, you were right. About everything. I was so terrified of being vulnerable that I chose to believe the worst, rather than accept that you could care about me without an agenda. I sabotaged the best thing that ever happened to me because I was convinced I didn't deserve it. And now I've spent 6 months learning to live without you, and I can't do it anymore." He looked up, and the pain in his green eyes was so raw it made her chest ache. "I've been going to therapy. Dr. Amanda Reeves. She specializes in attachment issues and childhood trauma. Turns out growing up with parents who treated love like a business transaction leaves some pretty deep scars." The admission surprised her. Damien Walker voluntarily seeking help for emotional issues was not something she'd ever imagined. That's good. That's really good. She helped me understand that I've been confusing love with control my entire adult life, that I push people away not because I don't care, but because I care too much and don't know how to handle it. What else did she help you understand? That you meant every word you said to me in that conference room, that when you told me you loved me, it was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to me, and that I threw it away because I was too damaged to recognize a gift when it was right in front of me. Tears pricked at the corners of Lena's eyes. "Damien, I'm not the same man who accused you of betraying me," he said urgently. "I'm not asking you to trust me because of who I was. I'm asking you to trust me because of who I'm becoming." And who is that? Someone who knows that love isn't weakness. Someone who understands that vulnerability isn't the same as surrender. Someone who's learned that the bravest thing you can do isn't build walls. It's tear them down for the right person. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box, setting it gently on the table between them. "What is this?" "Open it." With trembling fingers, Lena lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was the most beautiful ring she'd ever seen. A simple solitaire diamond set in what looked like handcrafted white gold, the band carved with delicate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work. "You made this," she breathed. "In my grandfather's workshop. It took me 4 months to get it right. 4 months of sanding and polishing and starting over when it wasn't perfect." His voice was rough with emotion. 4 months of thinking about you every time I touched the metal, every time I shaped the setting, every time I imagined what it would look like on your hand. Damien, I love you, Lena Carter. The words came out strong and sure and completely unguarded. I love your kindness and your strength, and the way you see the best in people even when they can't see it themselves. I love that you fight for what you believe in, and that you never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. "I love you too," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you in ways that might be unforgivable, but if you'll have me, if you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the love you offered me, I promise I'll never waste it again." "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you to marry me. I'm asking you to build a life with me, to let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. I'm asking you to take a chance on a man who's learned that the only thing more terrifying than being vulnerable is living without you." The cafe around them seemed to fade away as Lena stared at the ring, at this man who had torn apart his own walls to find his way back to her. "The rocking chair," she said suddenly. "What? You said you made a rocking chair but never had anyone to give it to." His smile was soft and wondering. "It's in the nursery." "What nursery?" "The one I've been building in my apartment for the past month, just in case, just in hope." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "You built a nursery?" "I built a future, for us, with rocking chairs and bookshelves and a kitchen table where we can have breakfast together every morning for the next 60 years. He reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. "But it's just furniture without you. Beautiful, carefully crafted furniture in an empty apartment where a man sits alone wondering what might have been. Damien, marry me, Lena. Let me spend the rest of my life calling you love and meaning every letter of it." She looked at the ring, at his hands holding hers, at the hope and fear and desperate love in his eyes. 6 months ago, she'd told him he was choosing to be alone. Today, he was choosing her. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll take a chance on us. Yes, I'll let you love me." She laughed through her tears. "But I have one condition. Anything. The next time you're scared, the next time you think you don't deserve happiness, you talk to me. You don't push me away. You don't make decisions for both of us. You just talk to me. I promise." He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook with emotion. "I promise to choose you every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." As he leaned across the table to kiss her, Lena realized that sometimes the greatest love stories weren't about two perfect people finding each other. They were about two imperfect people choosing to build something beautiful together, one honest conversation at a time. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, calling someone love by accident turned out to be the most intentional thing you'd ever done. Final message. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the smallest accidents. A single word, spoken without thinking, can change the course of two lives forever. Lena and Damien's journey reminds us that true love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other, again and again, even when fear whispers that we're not worthy of happiness. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, their story is a testament to the power of vulnerability, the courage required for second chances, and the magic that happens when two broken hearts decide to heal together. Love isn't always easy, but it's always worth fighting for. And sometimes the most profound truth is hidden in the simplest word, love. Do you believe some mistakes are actually destiny in disguise? Share your thoughts about second chances and fighting for love in the comments below. Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.